COVID-19 obviously had extreme economic implications and caused major changes both during and after the pandemic. For supply chain specifically, we have seen a shift from efficiency to resiliency. To get things started, it is important to understand what exactly supply chains are. As stated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, supply chains are the network of retailers, distributors, transporters, storage facilities, and suppliers that participate in the sale, delivery, production of a particular product or good. Supply chains are what allow us to get the goods and services we want and need, and over the years have become more and more advanced due to technological advances. Supply chain disruptions are the interruptions in the flow of goods and services. These disruptions can be caused by several different factors such as security attacks, transportation issues like weather or traffic, political events, and natural disasters. The effects of supply chain disruptions include shortages due to insufficient materials for specific products, inflation because demand rises as products become more scarce, causing prices to rise. Two final effects of supply chain disruptions are facility closures and unemployment. These two go together because as supply chain disruptions result in decreased productions, profits may fall and lead to companies having to close their stores or factories. These closures impact the job market because it results in the loss of jobs for the employees and less job opportunities for those currently unemployed. Effects of the supply chain Effects of supply chain disruptions include all of these things, but are not limited to them. Examples of previous events that have affected the supply chain include the Suez Canal incident and Brexit. In 2021, when a cargo ship got stuck in and blocked passage of other boats in the Suez Canal for nearly a week, global trade was interrupted and almost $10 billion in losses resulted each day. As for Brexit, the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union led to manufacturers having to set up their supply chain differently than before. Before the pandemic, the focus of the supply chain was on cost efficiency, which means the goal was to get goods to customers in a quick and cheap way. Companies did this by outsourcing portions of the supply chain, which helped with efficiency despite adding complexity to the process. More specifically, outsourcing helped cut storage overhead costs. Manufacturers also looked to have the smallest possible volume of parts, so they could cut costs and not waste supplies. These and all other efforts for efficiency in the supply chain were successful before the pandemic. In Britain, for example, the average cash price of durable goods fell by 15% from 2001 to 2016. The majority of these durable goods were imported. Despite the effectiveness of these cost-efficient supply chains, such a focus on efficiency left them susceptible to disruptions. Specifically, having a smaller volume of supplies could lead to minor disturbances, which cause major problems. The COVID-19 pandemic showed just how vulnerable these supply chains could be. As the COVID-19 pandemic was first declared, companies were forced to shut down factories, which inevitably disrupted the supply chain by interrupting the flow of goods. Also, massive increases in demand overflowed transportation networks and slowed down the process of delivering goods. As a result of the pandemic, there was an increase in demand for specific products unlike anything we had ever seen before. This likely is the biggest cause of supply chain disruptions rather than non-resilient supply chains. The argument could be made that supply chains were more resilient than they were given credit for being. An example of the supply chain proving to be rather resilient during the pandemic is the production of hand sanitizer. When the pandemic hit, the demand for hand sanitizer soared. As a result, Great Britain went from producing 16,000 tons for $2.90 a kilogram in 2019 to producing 86,000 tons with a price of $3.50 a kilogram throughout 2020, after facing shortages early on. When considering the unprecedented rise in demand for the product and only a 60-cent difference from 2019 to 2020 for hand sanitizer was not necessarily all that bad. Also, the supply chain was able to cover rather quickly to this unforeseen pandemic. Some other products saw substantial price increases during the pandemic. These prices these price increases came as a result of companies having trouble sourcing certain materials. The Global Supply Chain Pressure Index shows the great increases in price index for the supply chain globally during the pandemic, reaching points way beyond anything we'd ever seen before COVID-19. Now that the pandemic is behind us and society is transitioning back to normal, the supply chain has also recovered, but some changes have been made. The biggest changes that we have seen The biggest change that we have seen in the supply chain since the pandemic is the use of more diverse supply sourcing. Companies are now looking to spread out supply sources across the country. This new strategy has led to less reliance on China and the rest of Asia. It also includes the use of more technologies to keep operations going. Apple has been diversifying their suppliers by shifting some of its supply sources beyond China. They now have production facilities in India. Companies have begun to diversify suppliers after the pandemic so that they will be less vulnerable if there is a similar event in the future. Spreading out suppliers results in a more resilient supply chain. Among these efforts, companies are also looking to have regional suppliers that are close to where the products are going to be sold. They also they are also looking to move their sources around the world and avoid single sourcing. One downside to spreading out suppliers is that it is more expensive, but companies will do it anyway to avoid possible disruptions in the future. It is a trade-off that many companies are willing to make. Another big change since the pandemic is the increasing importance of sustainability. Companies now must follow new regulations put in place for sustainability efforts. The Securities and Exchange Commission in the US is requiring that companies release their carbon emissions along with the carbon emissions of their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers. These three together make up what is called the Scope 3 emissions. These sustainability regulations make diversifying suppliers more difficult and expensive since spreading out suppliers leads to more carbon emissions. The pandemic has also led to the end of the just-in-time principle method used with inventories. The just-in-time principle method was when inventories were kept small to keep costs low and efficiency high. After the shortages seen during the pandemic, this is likely to be a method of the past. The need for more reliable inventories will be another increase in cost throughout the supply chain. On a more positive note, the pandemic forced quicker adoption of technology from companies trying to ship goods quicker. Yofi Sheffi, the director of Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Center for Transportation and Logistics, believes that this adoption is expected to have lasting impacts on the supply chain. Sheffi believes that companies have learned that they can do things that they did not think were possible, all because they were forced to try new things during the pandemic. Among these strategies are the trimming of product lines, resetting sourcing, and using other tools to rebound from early shortages. Companies are doing many things to create a more resilient supply chain. Listed here are some of the leading strategies to not only achieve this goal but to improve supply chains overall. Inventory cushions are an extra supply of parts that can be used in the case of supply chain disruption. The pro of this strategy is that the supply chain would be less affected by disruptions. The con of the strategy is that there will be additional expenses for the extra supply. Digitalization is the use of AI to identify risks and potential disruptions in the supply chain before they occur. Digitalization can help suppliers determine the correct amount of supplies needed at a certain time. Technology can also create a supply chain map that identifies specific risky points along the chain. Next, we have localization. Some companies use local supplies for their products to avoid using international trade. This helps avoid some possible disruptions. There is also nearshoring, which is using suppliers in close proximity to the company to cut transportation costs and time. Shipping costs soared during the pandemic, but have now started to normalize again. Here we can see the costs over time for the Freight Baltic Index, also known as the FBX. The FBX shows that during COVID, freight rates reached unprecedented levels. The FBX stayed above anything we'd ever seen pre-pandemic until heading into 2023. Now, the FBX is back where it was before the pandemic, showing great recovery since its struggles during the pandemic. As we can see, the pandemic has caused many changes to the supply chain. New goals and strategy have been put in place to improve the supply chain and avoid problems of the past. But the pandemic had certain effects on the supply chain that will continue to last, while other things are finally starting to look the way they did pre-pandemic. Each specific industry is dealing with its own issues after the pandemic. The fuel industry has continued to struggle post-pandemic due to conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The result of this has been supply disruptions and price increases. Countries who would get their oil from Russia have had to find new suppliers, further complicating things. The food and construction industries have also seen some lasting effects, which I will discuss next. Supply chain disruptions have had different implications depending on the industry. For the food industry, supply chain disruptions lead to the increase of food prices since agriculture follows a tight schedule through specific seasons and weather. And as we can see here on this graph, it shows many different things such as meat, dairy, and cereals and how they were affected during the pandemic. And they're all were trending upwards through the pandemic, and then they all seem to be lowering now, but are still above levels that we saw like leading up into the pandemic. For the construction industry, materials and labor costs are rising. When we look at Australia, for example, labor and material costs rose by 15% in 2021, which was the highest rise in 7 years. When looking at the graph, we can see that some more essential materials like structural timber and reinforcing steel have seen even larger increases in price. When putting everything into consideration, is a focus on a more resilient supply chain the best thing for our economy? The advantages of a more resilient supply chain for our economy is that it will allow us to be more prepared for future disasters. With the way supply chains are being rebuilt, we would be more prepared for another pandemic. Despite the good that comes from resilience, there is a clear disadvantage of going this route, and that is cost. Building up a stronger supply chain means the need for more supplies being produced, as well as companies spreading out their supply chain to several different suppliers, all located in different places. Doing this will increase expenses for the supply chain and therefore lead to more expensive products for consumers. Also, companies using multiple suppliers will create more carbon emissions and be environmentally unfriendly. Building a more resilient supply chain is certainly not a bad thing, but we must make sure we are not just simply preparing for the worst, as that could be costly for all parties involved. Finding the correct balance between a well-protected supply chain and an efficient supply chain is what we need to avoid future problems and keep costs reasonable. Regardless, it is refreshing to see supply chains normalizing after the disruptions it faced during the pandemic.